Zadrian Vane had collected many things in his life: properties across 4 cities, loyalties purchased at prices that would have alarmed anyone with the full accounting of them, silence, in quantities that would have surprised the people whose silence he had acquired, and that would have unsurprised them completely had they understood the nature of the man doing the acquiring. He had collected debts and favors and the kind of strategic relationships that existed in no ledger, but were nevertheless the most valuable assets in his portfolio, more reliable than real estate, more liquid than cash, more durable than any formal agreement that required signatures and witnesses, and the good faith of people who had demonstrated repeatedly that their good faith was a performance rather than a principle. He had never collected a person before. He told himself this was different only in degree. The SUV pulled through the gates of the Vane estate at 11:40, and Zadrian stepped out without waiting for the door to be opened, a habit that his security detail had stopped attempting to correct after the third time he made clear that the correction itself was more irritating than the habit. He walked toward the entrance without looking back at the vehicle, which meant he did not see the precise moment Zelia crossed, stepped out of it, and stood for the first time on the gravel of a driveway that her father had stood on once years ago, under circumstances that Zadrian had long since filed in the category of concluded business. She saw everything. The estate had the specific grandeur of a place that had been designed to communicate the permanence of its owner's position, which was to say, it had been designed by someone who understood that the most effective intimidation is architectural, that stone and glass and carefully considered scale produce in visitors a physiological response that no verbal threat can reliably replicate. Zelia stood in the cold night air and looked at it with the systematic attention of someone conducting an assessment rather than experiencing an impression, her eyes moving across the facade with the quiet and methodical patience of a woman, cataloging what she is looking at rather than simply registering how it makes her feel. She had been cataloging this estate for 3 years from the outside. Being inside, it was simply the next phase of work she had already begun. Zadrian turned at the entrance and looked at her standing on his driveway in the coat his assistant had procured during the 40-minute drive from the bridge, a replacement for the damp and weathered thing she had been wearing when he found her. And he looked at her with the assessing attention of a man examining a recent acquisition for the first time under good lighting. She was composed in a way he had not fully registered under the bridge. Not the performed composure of someone managing their reaction to an overwhelming environment, which was what he had expected, and what every other person brought into this house for the first time produced without exception: the wide eyes and the caught breath, and the involuntary recalibration of posture that expensive spaces reliably produce in people, encountering them from the outside for the first time. She simply looked at the house the way a person looks at something they have been expecting. He filed this without examining it and gestured toward the entrance. She walked past him without hesitation, without the slight deferential pause that people produced when passing Zadrian Vane in a doorway, and he watched her cross the threshold of his home with the particular awareness of a man who has just noticed something he cannot yet name and is deciding whether it requires naming. His head of house, a composed woman named Petra, met them in the entry hall with the efficient neutrality of someone who had been given instructions and intended to execute them without editorial comment regardless of what the instructions contained. Zadrian told Petra to show her to the East guest suite and to ensure she had everything she required for the evening. Zelia followed Petra without looking back at Zadrian. She carried the black ledger against her chest with the same grip she had maintained since the bridge, the grip of someone carrying something whose value is not decorative and whose loss would be consequential. And Zadrian noticed the ledger for the second time in the way that you notice a detail the second time differently than you notice it the first, with the slight additional weight of something that has been registered twice and is therefore no longer entirely dismissible. He watched her disappear up the east staircase. Then he poured himself a bourbon and stood in the entry hall of his estate and thought about the wager and the $5 million and the absolute certainty he had carried from the underground lounge to the bridge to this moment that he was the only person in any of those locations who understood what was actually happening. He was still certain. He was also still watching the top of the east staircase. Zelia was compliant in the specific way that should have alarmed him, not passive, not broken. Not the dull and defeated compliance of someone whose spirit has been extinguished by circumstance, and who moves through the world on the residual momentum of a person who has stopped deciding things for themselves. That kind of compliance Zadrian recognized and understood, and had produced deliberately in people on more occasions than he had ever found it useful to count. What Zelia produced was something different, a compliance that was present in every observable behavior and absent in every unobservable one, that existed perfectly at the surface, and that had, beneath the surface, the quality of something that had been placed there rather than grown there. He noticed it the way he noticed the ledger, with the second register, the one he did not yet act on. The first week established the pattern. Petra reported that Zelia rose at 6, ate what was prepared without complaint or preference, participated in the wardrobe consultations that Zadrian's stylist conducted with the attentive cooperation of a woman learning a language she intends to become fluent in, and spent the hours between appointments in the East guest suite with the black ledger, and a silence that Petra described, when Zadrian asked her directly, as focused rather than withdrawn. He asked Petra what the distinction was. Petra said that withdrawn people were absent from their surroundings, and that Zelia was very present in hers, simply quiet about it. Zadrian found this answer interesting enough to revisit twice before filing it. By the end of the first week, she had been introduced to his primary social circle, at a dinner that he had constructed with the deliberate design of a man testing a variable in a controlled environment. He wanted to see how she navigated rooms where the social architecture was complex, and the consequences of misreading it were visible and immediate. He had watched other women in that room over the years consume themselves with the effort of impression management, the overextended laughter and the careful mirroring, and the exhausting performance of belonging to a world that had not yet extended them membership. Zelia did not perform belonging. She simply behaved as though the question of whether she belonged had been settled before she arrived, and was therefore not a matter requiring her ongoing attention. 3 of his most perceptive associates commented on her afterward. All 3 used the same word: composed. Zadrian poured his bourbon that evening and stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass and looked at the city and thought about the word and thought about the ledger and thought about the way she had looked at the estate on the first night from the driveway, with the eyes of someone who had been expecting it, and he assembled these details in the part of his mind that he used for threat assessment, and he looked at what they produced when arranged together. He did not act on what they produced. He told himself he was being thorough. He was being something else entirely. He was being interested, which was the condition he was least equipped to manage safely, and the one he had always been most reluctant to acknowledge in himself, because interest was the one instrument in any room that he did not know how to use without cost, the one that had the specific and dangerous property of working in both directions simultaneously. He was collecting her. She was collecting him. Only one of them knew both things were happening. He finished his bourbon and turned from the glass and walked toward the east wing with the unhurried ease of a man who believes he is moving through his own house on his own terms in the direction of his own choosing. And in the east guest suite 2 floors above him, Zelia Cross opened the black ledger to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top in her precise and angular handwriting, and beneath the date she wrote 3 words: Phase 2 confirmed. Then she closed the ledger and placed it under the mattress of the bed, in the exact position she had identified on the first night, as the location least likely to be disturbed by the morning cleaning rotation, a position she had determined by observing Petra's staff for 4 days with the systematic attention of a woman who understands that the difference between a plan that works and a plan that does not is almost always a detail that someone else considered too small to matter. She turned off the lamp. She lay in the dark of Zadrian Vane's East guest suite, and listened to the security rotation complete its circuit below her window, and counted the seconds between each pass with the patient and unhurried precision of a woman who has nowhere else to be, and nothing more important to do than learn the rhythm of the thing she intends to dismantle.